Test. Test 1, test 2.
Testing. That was brutal, sorry. Testing, testing, 1, 2, 3. Ooh.
This isn't a joke, but where Mark Anderson is going to be lead in the play Annie in November at Benson Little Theater, and a bunch of us are going. I hope all of you will come. Who's playing Annie Warbucks? Yes. I'm going to say. That's a different thing.
Back to the days of Shakespeare and Peter Pan, where guys like Mark just do all the parts. That sounds great. So what part are you playing, Mark? Oh, how exciting. That's awesome. And that's November the 5th?
November the second 2 weekends, the 11th through the 20th. It's Friday, Saturday, and Sunday, starting November 11th and then next week.
How exciting. But y'all are going on the 13th.
We're going on the 13th, yes. Grace members are going on the 13th. I have one ticket that's not sold. I bought 10, and I have 9 people going, so I have one ticket available.
How exciting. November 13th. All right, Whitewater, let's do this. Sorry about the microphone thing. It's on now and not going to mess up our hair anymore or anything like that. Okay, so the purpose of this meeting is informational and just have a little time for question and answer. The reason I decided to do this, and other pastors think I'm crazy, but go figure, is that our churchwide assembly hadn't met since the beginning of COVID. As you all are, I'm sure, aware, we are part of a 3-expression church: the congregational expression, that's us. We have the synodical expression, the North Carolina Synod, and then there are 65 synods in the ELCA. And so the ELCA has the presiding bishop, Bishop Elizabeth Eaton, and the last time they were supposed to do one of their every 3 years or triennial gatherings, they couldn't because of COVID. So they did it this year, the year 2022, last month. It ran August 9th through 13th or something. They had live streams available for some of their plenary sessions. There's a reason why these things take 4 or 5 days. A lot of it is quiet space. There's a lot of worship too. And then there's kind of the business part of the assemblies that they have. They call those plenary sessions. At those sessions, they pass a budget for the ELCA for the coming 3 years. Remember that the next one of these gatherings will be in 2025, and if anybody is interested in representing Grace or the North Carolina Synod, I can help you to fill out the paperwork to do that. Does anybody know where the next one is, now that I say that? It's somewhere. And yeah, it's a really cool experience, I've heard. But this one was held in Columbus, Ohio, which is interesting because back in the mid-'80s, there were 2 of these things, I believe, in Columbus, Ohio, and the ELCA Constitution, which solidified and formed the ELCA as a church body, was ratified at that gathering. It was in 1988 when that happened in Columbus, Ohio. So part of what we're going to talk about today has to do with that. I just wanted to remind everybody that in Grace happenings over the past couple weeks, and will continue for the next couple weeks, there are links to elca.org, the big website, and from there, well, our link goes directly into the Assembly website, and it has lists of all the things that happened, all the people that were elected to church council and things like that, some of the other statements that were made and things like that. It's all available there. So what we're going to do is a very short form. I've picked out 3 or 4 things that I think were worth mentioning. And so that's our purpose for today. The reason that other pastors think I'm a little nutty for doing this is that, like, why open up all of these discussions? And my answer is they're already opened up. And you all, as members of a denomination, I think deserve to know and have free and safe space in your congregation with your pastor to hear about some of the conversations that are happening, even if they won't go anywhere, but to understand and hear from me and from each other what it is that the ELCA as a denominational church, all 65 synods, are doing together. There's lots of work that the ELCA does in things like Lutheran World Relief and lots of other outreach type of things that we can do on a global scale as the ELCA that we would really struggle to do even as synods. So there's a lot of that kind of thing that happens, but there's also a lot of business, like I mentioned, passing budgets and, you know, this and that kind of thing. Two of the things that I thought are worthwhile to bring up are going to be kind of the focus and the agenda for our meeting. There is also in your Grace Happenings email a link to an article that lists out 6 or 7 of the big things that happened. I've picked and chosen from there what I think, you know, bears are talking about together. I wanted to mention for folks who are on live stream, we do have a chat option. And so when we have time for questions, you are welcome to type into the chat, and we've got somebody monitoring that chat who's going to make sure those questions are heard and answered or sort of danced around, whatever. The ELCA last month elected Imran Siddiqui as their vice president of the entire denomination. That makes him the first Asian American elected to the highest office that a layperson can hold in our denomination. So we're grateful for that. All 3 of the finalists in that were people of color, which I think is worth noting. And this is a person who has a huge amount of experience in this kind of level of the church. The incoming vice president, again, Imran Siddiqui, is a senior investigator for the U.S. Department of Labor and currently serves as the vice president of the Southeastern Synod of the ELCA, which spans Georgia, Tennessee, Alabama, and Mississippi. We thought that our synod was big, but there's a great big synod for you. Any questions about that? I think that's significant. I think that that's a good thing for our church. Another one of the major ticket items that if you click on plenary number 2, gets a lot of discussion, is support for what's called the hashtag Land Back. I'm not sure if this is something that anyone has heard of before, but voting members considered a memorial urging support for the hashtag Land Back movement. In the end, our church approved a memorial encouraging ELCA members and entities to, and I quote, support creative programs of restorative justice in partnership with indigenous peoples that can include returning land to the appropriate Native American nations when selling or transferring property. We'll hang on to ours, but that's something that, for which we've opened the door. The memorial also encourages ELCA members and entities to explore making land acknowledgements a part of their public gatherings. So when we gather for worship or when I start my sermon, if you hear me say we are partially on the land of such and such nations of peoples, that could be a possibility. The memorial comes as the denomination announced its declaration of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America to American, this is all capitals, American Indian and Alaska Native people for the first time in person at Churchwide Assembly. The assembly also hosted a worship service designed and led by Indigenous Lutherans and an address by National Congress of American Indians President Fawn Sharp. It's kind of a neat thing to watch if you wanted to click on that link and give that a watch. Another of the big ticket items that got a lot of conversation was revisions to a document called Human Sexuality, Gift, and Trust. Those of you who have been involved with candidacy or seminary before know that in the past we've signed documents called Vision and Expectations. This is the newer version of that was ratified in 2009, Human Sexuality, Gift, and Trust. A lot has changed since 2009, so I'm going to read from their own text just to make sure I say it right. The ELCA adopted its social statement, Human Sexuality, Gift, and Trust, which allowed Lutherans to hold differing views about same-sex relationships and open the door for LGBTQ clergy. That was the first step in the discussion of 2008 and 2009 that opened the door for ordaining LGBTQ clergy. Social statements are the denomination's teaching of and policy documents. A memorial authorized a narrow review of the social statement about sexuality to make sure its wording, and I quote, reflects current church understanding, church policy, civil law, and public acceptance of same-gender and gender nonconforming couples, end quote. A later motion asked that the denomination in particular consider the 4 positions of bound conscience expressed in the social statement. The statement allows that on the basis, this is a quote, on the basis of conscience-bound belief, Lutherans may have different views about sexuality and marriage, including the view that same-sex relationships are sinful. Revisions could be considered as early as the 2025 Churchwide Assembly. So the way to read that is that there was a statement made in the plenary that we ought to revise this document called Human Sexuality, Gift, and Trust, broaden it to reflect the current church understanding, church policy, civil law, and public acceptance of same-gender and gender nonconforming couples. There was also a motion on the floor in the moment that it also be included that Lutherans, ELCA Lutherans, can hold space for the belief that same-sex relationships are sinful. So what I see here is a broadening in a couple of directions to try to be inclusive, which is probably a good thing, I suppose. Any of us who lived through the 2008-2009 discussions, and some would say the split, which I know Grace Lutheran did, might welcome kind of a broadening of the possibility of different beliefs. I personally, as your pastor, believe that it's not our primary identity, it's not our primary concern. Paul says there is no longer Jew nor Greek, male nor female, slave nor free. Those kind of identities are secondary when we are in Christ, and so we ought to still come together as one church to celebrate Christ crucified and risen, regardless of gender questions. It remains a part of our conversation as a church as we try to honor all people and welcome all people. And I hope that you know here at Grace, all are truly welcome, but this is the result of the ELCA Churchwide Assembly, the words that I've said here. Let's take a pause for a moment there. I wonder if there are any questions or concerns either on the live stream or here in the room. I'm going to get a drink of water too. Yes, Mark.
I did have a chance to look through all of the topics from the plenary session, but one that I saw that seemed to be also generating a lot of conversation was the leader's proposal to look at sort of completely rewriting and revamping the ELCA overall constitution.
Yeah.
And I couldn't believe, at least from what I read,
Thank you. The question in the room is, for those who are on live stream or couldn't hear, a question about what I have next on my agenda. That certainly is probably the center point of our conversation today. A question of, we're just taking a break for a second, but that's a good segue. It didn't sound like there were other questions. So the question in the room was about something that someone saw through the link that was sent out and through their own reading of what was happening at the plenary sessions, about a conversation about completely reorganizing and restructuring the constitution of the ELCA as a church entity. And maybe we'll just leave it there for a moment. The question was whether it was something about the structure of the ELCA and maybe an authority question, or was it more of a faith and practice question? Does that speak to your question well enough? This is kind of the center point for the discussion, but before we dive in too deeply, I wanted to make sure that you know, and this is really why we need to be in a room together talking about this, because you're ELCA people, and you should know the discussions that are happening at the other levels of our denomination. So there was indeed a statement, and I believe it came from 12 separate synods, all came to the floor of the plenary session there at Churchwide, and they all had something to do with what we call reconstituting the ELCA. And a couple of important things to notice. First of all, when you really read into the text, or if you were listening, and when you listen to the text, what we've decided to do as a church body is to organize a team to investigate reconstituting the ELCA. They will report back to the 2025 Churchwide Assembly and make some kind of a recommendation to the bishop and to the others, the church council, about possibly reconstituting the ELCA. That process could begin at the 2025 assembly, but that would take a further 3 years to report back. What it may wind up doing is leading us to a constitutional convention, which would be separate from the churchwide assembly and would have the specific purpose of reconstituting the ELCA. So this is going to take some time to really flesh out. There are more questions than there are answers at this point. In fact, I'll do my best to field questions, but when you read through, I mean, your question's a very good one. Is it really more about structure and authority? Is it more about faith and practice? It's kind of about all of those things. I think there's a lot of reasons why this came to the floor, especially from 12 separate synods, all saying, hey, let's think about this, let's do this. Bishop Eaton called it a brilliant idea when it was brought to the floor. I think she's very much in favor of a reconstituting effort. But again, it's gonna really take some time. I think that in order to speak to Mark's question and not just dance around it, I think most of it has to do with authority and structure rather than faith and practice. I think there were a lot of unanswerable questions raised by especially a particular set of events that happened out in the Sierra Pacific Synod. You can read all about this online if you want to, but in very short form, there was a bishop who fired a pastor. It was the pastor of a Spanish-speaking congregation in Stockton, California, and they did that on the feast day of Our Lady of Guadalupe. It was very poorly handled. There was a lot of questions about, can the bishop of a synod do that? And didn't they need to check with somebody first or kind of work with the congregation first? Then it took several months for presiding Bishop Eaton to really say anything about it, at which time she set up a committee to investigate. And then it took another several months for any action to be taken, which was the removal of that bishop from their synod. Questions remain, and if this is your thing, go through and read the Constitution of the ELCA and try to figure out, does the presiding bishop have that authority to remove a bishop that way? It's the kind of thing that's fine most of the time because it doesn't really come up. This was an extremely rare but extremely difficult situation. And we're not altogether clear about what this all means. Eventually the bishop just resigned because there was so much pressure and so many questions, and the presiding bishop had asked this person to resign. So I think more than anything else, that brought up a lot of questions about authority and structure. What is the function of the presiding bishop other than making social statements and kind of guiding the church in a general way? What are the functions of the bishops of synods? We know in some way what our synod helps us with. We know what we're capable of as a synod. But should there be more of a focus on synodical authority and less on churchwide authority, or the other way around? That's the kind of thing that this committee is going to be looking at. It doesn't have to do so much with faith and practice. As a matter of fact, I think it's worthwhile for us to talk about so that you know what's happening. I think it'll change our daily lives very little. But as a church with three expressions, we need to be aware of what's happening at these different levels. So that's kind of the long and the short of it. I want you to hear me say, truthfully, that at the end of this years-long process, could there be a different church than the ELCA? Yes, there could. And it feels like it's kind of moving in that direction. But whatever it is that's happening, we will be a part of, we will have voice in, and we'll get to make some decisions about, let's say if there's some kind of a divergence, we'll get together and decide what we want to do. But I'll still be your pastor, and you'll still be a congregation. We'll still be Lutheran. We'll still get to hold on to our moral values and get to live those out. But at some of the higher levels, there could be some change kind of blowing in the wind. That's kind of where we're at. I want to make sure I didn't miss anything. Okay. So with that, with what we've said, with the question that was already asked, did I answer your question?
Yeah, I think so. Of course, you got more details, but there's not enough to water, so.
Pretty much, yeah. Yeah, when our pastors got together for the Triangle Conference meeting, which happens here at Grace, we talked about it, and the overwhelming answer to everything is we'll see. We'll see who's on this committee, what they're looking into specifically. We'll see. We'll see what that looks like. And the other pastors think I'm crazy because why have this discussion now when we don't know that much? Well, I want to keep you informed about what's happening. You are devoted members of a denominational church. This is how we celebrate Christ together, and we need to know, I think. So much better than 3 years from now if I stood up here and said, oh, by the way, we're reconstituting the ELCA. There's not going to be an ELCA anymore. And you're going, what? Where did that come from? Why didn't you tell us? Well, this is what we're doing. Was there a question back there?
I just went to that link that was in the Grace Happenings on the 5 points, and on the one on restructure the governance of the ELCA, the memorial that they passed spoke of the memorial instructs the commission to be particularly attentive to our shared commitment to dismantle racism. And so that piece you were talking about that might have stirred this individual one thing more. And then it also wanted to point out at the same time, something else I've run into when looking at constructing contracts with pastors was that one group, and I don't remember who it was, like there was the ACA, the American Lutheran Church, and the other one. One of them went on, had used a 10% contribution from the church for pensions, and the other one used 12%. And that's still kind of depending on which end you came from out there. And this might be something in a different area that they might be looking to try to get equalized out. So, there's a lot of different possibilities.
Could be. Yeah, it could be. So the first part of that is that there is a line in the memorial that says we're asking this committee to pay particular attention to our need to dismantle racism, which as an ELCA church, we are committed to that work. And I think that it does stem from the goings-on of that one synod, but that's work that we're all in together for sure. And I, as your pastor, would support anything that's done to be sure that that's the work that we're about as a church. It's really tricky to raise your hand and say, I don't like that, I'd rather be racist. But we do have to be intentional about doing that. This was a particularly tricky situation as it unfolded in California, but I know, and you know, that across the country, across North America, there are situations that are tricky because we haven't got this thing all the way figured out yet, but that we as a church ought to be about the business of dismantling racism and working forward from there. So that is in there, and I think it's appropriate. The other part, I kind of talked myself, the other part was about possibly either equalizing or creating more freedom for congregations to do things like pay pensions at a rate that they think is fair. Some are at 10%, some are at 12%. I'm thankful for you all. So that could be. Another thing that I've heard raised specifically, this was by our bishop, Bishop Tim Smith of the North Carolina Synod, wondered aloud at our gathering early in the summer whether bishops ought to have, and I want to be careful here, don't jump to any conclusions, whether synodical bishops ought to be able to appoint pastors. He was very quick to say, there are some situations where we have yoked ministries that have been without pastors for years that need a pastor, and they're not cooperating, or certain places that might need a specific type of pastor. If a failing congregation needs a mission developer to build it again, they should maybe have some say in that, but I think we all enjoy what we call congregational polity. That's your decision to make as a congregation, not necessarily sort of that hierarchy of the bishop appoints pastors, but I think that's one thing they're going to be looking at too. Not just the relationship between the presiding bishop and synodical bishops, but also synodical bishops with the pool of pastors. There's a hefty pastor shortage at this point, and in some ways it feels like synod bishops have their hands tied when it comes to making sure that some churches would rather die than have a pastor that's different than what they've thought of before. So we could let them do that, or we could have a conversation about what it might look like if the bishop had that kind of authority. I don't know what'll come of that, but we'll see. Other questions from all of y'all? Yes?
So is the sexuality issue being brought up, that there might be changes? It sounds like there may be changes to what was first written. What was that, 10 years ago, 20 years ago?
Yeah, 2009. It was officially ratified in 2009. That happened when I was in seminary. It was like, hey, you signed this thing called Vision and Expectations. We're throwing that away. Sign this other thing now. Okay. But yeah, and this, again, you have access to that through the ELCA website if you want to know exactly what's in there. It's the kind of thing that says, as a pastor, I know that the bodies of the people who are around me in the congregational setting are important, and I will not betray the trust of people by overstepping my boundaries, that type of thing. It asks pastors to be in monogamous relationships or none at all while they're at least studying, and a bunch of other stuff. But yeah, so I think what'll probably come of that, we'll see. But, and this is how the church works. It just, for years we talk about this stuff. But at the end, in 2025, I think probably there will be a new statement. And so when people are moving through candidacy in the ELCA, they'll have something new to look at and sign.
I think that it wasn't so much a change in policy as it was the language. I served on the candidacy committee all my career, and the problem that we found in the candidacy committee was that the language that's used in the older documents just doesn't fit the candidates we have now. And so just in some cases it's pronouns and verbs, it's just things that needed to be changed. And in the end, it was realizing that the document was just so dated and didn't fit the candidates that we have now. So it really just, the whole thing needed to be revamped. So I don't, unless I missed something, I mean, because it's been a while now, but it wasn't like redoing our expectations and things, but it is rewording everything so that we can apply it to those that we have seeking
ministry to be pastors and deacons, and so
Yep,
is that?
I think so, yeah. It's kind of like what we do with the personnel team here at the church. We want to make sure that job descriptions fit what we're expecting people to actually do. So every once in a while, you don't go to your staff and say, here are the things you're not doing. Instead, we sit down with them and say, let's take a look at your job description and make sure it matches what we're actually expecting from you. Same kind of thing here, where we take a look at the document and don't necessarily say, hey, you have to be this kind of person or promise this, that, or the other. We're adding those things. Instead, we'll take a look back at the document and saying, does this actually fit who we want to be ministers in the church and who want to be ministers in the church? Yes.
I would just like to say that as a member of this congregation, I appreciate you deciding that you wanted to let us know ahead of time rather than waiting 3 years and having it put us up the side of the head. Thank you.
Yep, thank you for staying. There's so many things that are easier to not talk about, but this is what we do together. Yeah. We learn and grow, and we're part of a church that is interested in learning and growing too. So yeah, I do not want to be in the situation where it's like, why didn't you ever tell us? You know, you knew this. I think some people are planning on saying, well, you can check the ELCA website. Is everybody doing that like on a weekly basis? Probably not. I don't know how much time you have on your hands, but, and some do. And for some, this is their life. They've dedicated their lives to the ministry of working out these kinds of things. Thanks be to God, because it gives us a great framework structure as a church to sort of build within. I'm glad that some people have this passion and do this, and they're going to be working for the next 3 years to present something in 2025 that hopefully we can all be in discussion about and ultimately say, okay, this is who we are as church together. And I'm glad that we're part of a denomination that, at least in my own perspective, chooses to try to take steps forward to meet people as they actually are and where they actually are, rather than taking steps backward. There's not always an agreement about what that looks like, but I think that that's the work that they're going to continue, that we are going to continue to do as we move forward, and I'm grateful. Yeah.
I think this move is also a reflection of the increasing polarization in our country and in our society.
Is this move part to address the polarization that's happening in America on so many social levels, and where the truth is and all of that?
I do, and what I hope, the question was, do we think that this is a reflection of the increasing polarization of our country, of our society, our culture, at almost every level? I think that it is, but what I hope for is, rather than saying like, we're going to make sure we come down on one side of that, instead what I hope it is a little bit of a broad, say all are welcome. Do we really mean that? Or is it just the people who think like we do? And so we want to make sure that we wind up over here. I'm going to move in both directions just to confuse everyone, but let's make sure we wind up over here so that we can be right and everybody else will be wrong. I mean, we all have our beliefs. We see Christ expressed in the world from our viewpoint. I think as a church, we share so much and such a passion for ministry that bridges divides rather than furthers them. So what I hope for is a way for us to say, when we say all are welcome, that means if there's two sides, it means both sides. If there's more than that, it means all sides. Because whenever we see a line drawn in the sand, I feel like we see Jesus from the other side saying, come and see, not let's build a wall now, so to speak. Lynn?
Last weekend, I attended the Synodical Women's Gathering. We did it online this year again, and Bishop Smith was there and did an address, and he told us about some of these things that happened at the gathering that he had been to. And also, I just wanted to restate that Bishop Eaton has also met with the National Women's Organization, and all of that was brought to us. We had a national representative on line too, and all of these things were talked about, and I think this is great that you're doing and talking about it here. It gave the women of North Carolina the opportunity to learn more and also to discuss some of the disparaging things that are happening to the women and women pastors, and what we're trying to do to rectify and make things right. And I just think that this is marvelous, and thank you for helping us.
Yeah, great, good, thank you. Thanks for sharing, and it's so appropriate that this be talked about in those kind of settings, but also in this kind of setting so that we don't have a few who know and others that don't. But yeah, well, and just to expand on what I've already said, hopefully always the direction that we're moving is honoring that all people are made in the image of God and called into diverse and various ministries and should be empowered to do so. If you don't think there's still an issue with women serving in the church in the way that they're treated and spoken to and just not given full value, go to the Synod website and check out the Seriously ? Video. It's male pastors reading statements that have been made to female pastors that the female pastors have written down. You will be shocked at the things that are still said to women who are in ministry. Some went before us and really crawled under the barbed wire, but it is still there. And so we ought to be acknowledging that, looking for ways to make that better.
Bishop Smith viewed that. He shared that. And a
Oh,
lot of
yeah.
women on the conference had not seen it yet.
Yeah.
Startling for them. I had seen it several times.
It is startling. It should be. I was on a podcast that they did to accompany that because I know Reverend Marcia Kiefer, who was ordained in 1982, and got to share a little bit of her story. But yeah, we ought to be better, do better, continue moving forward. Because I am convinced, just like Paul says, I am convinced that an amazing diversity of people are called into pastoral leadership and other leadership in the church, and they ought to be honored and loved and encouraged in what they're doing, and that doesn't always happen. So anyway, yeah, thank you for sharing. Other thoughts, questions? Anything come through on the live stream chat? Okay. Other thoughts or questions that anybody wanted to share? As I receive updates, I'll make sure to make them known to you. We can do this again at some point just to kind of update the situation. The way that these things happen, it can be hard to kind of follow the progress. But certainly in 2025, I plan on still being here. Don't run me off because I'm just joking with you. We'll certainly do this probably leading up to that assembly to say, here's what we're expecting, here's what to keep an eye on. Perhaps we'll gather as a congregation and make the live stream available in some kind of shared format here or elsewhere so we can kind of be in on this together. And again, if you are interested in serving the church by attending as a voting member or as a visitor one of these assemblies, let me know and we can start to get the paperwork together. And we vote on that at our biannual assembly here in North Carolina. So I'm guessing there will be a lot who want to, but yeah, Denny.
In 2008, when the issue of holiness first came up, we were all asked if we wanted to submit faith statements on the issue to the Synod. Would that be probably something else we would happen into 2025?
It could be. It could be. And are you talking about the document, Human Sexuality, Gift, and Trust?
Well, we were just asking, and maybe it wasn't everybody, but to write down and do prayer and Bible study and write down where we felt as far as inclusivity goes and and then that was sent to the synod for review apparently by the committees.
Yeah, we could do that. And also in the conversation about reconstituting, if we would want to gather faith statements, it sounds like they're keeping a special eye on dismantling racism. And so if we wanted to write faith statements about that, perhaps we could supply those. But I could see us doing that because our voices need to be heard. We are the ELCA, so I think that's important.
And we're Lutherans.
And we're Lutherans.
We like to post things on church doors.
Yeah, exactly. We post things on church doors. That's who we are. That's what we do. Yeah, we'll get 95 of them and we'll put it online.
We actually have done faith statements and presented it to the Senate.
Right. Yeah. Good. That's what we should do. And I think rather than seeing it as a burden, synods see that, not all of them, but see that as welcome. Because so often they get complained to after the fact rather than informed before the fact. So to make our voices heard, I think, is appropriate. Let's end with the word of prayer before we go. Good and gracious God, you have knit us together as the family of Christ, the church, O God. So many visions of the unification of Christ and the church come to us through our scriptures, and we give you thanks that we are part of the assembly of believers. And we ask, O God, that you would bless and guide us, our congregation, our synod, and our synod staff, the ELCA Churchwide Expression, our bishop, Bishop Eaton, and her staff. We ask, O God, that we might always affirm the diversity of humanity, your diversity as reflected in humanity, that we might empower all people to serve the gospel. We ask, O God, that as we continue having conversations together, that you would unite us in our faith. In Jesus' name, amen. All right, thanks, everybody.